Zen Buddhism treats death with a directness that feels almost illegal. December 12, 1481. Mountains near Kyoto. The smell of incense, shallow breathing. An 87-year-old monk's body is shutting down. His disciples crowd the room, trying not to cry. This is it, the moment they've dreaded for years. The master who scandalized Japan, who called himself Blind Donkey, who mocked the Buddhist establishment for 9 decades, is dying. Ikkyu opens his eyes and smiles. Not a peaceful smile, a smile like he finally got the punchline after 87 years. What this master discovered about death could revolutionize how fearlessly you're willing to live. Today we're exploring 3 Japanese Zen masters who transformed humanity's greatest terror into their deepest joy. But I need to warn you, this conversation will ask you to look directly at the one thing most people spend their lives avoiding. By the end, you might discover that everything you thought you knew about death was backwards. Ikkyu lived from 1394 to 1481, during one of the most corrupt periods in Japanese Buddhist history. Monasteries had become political institutions. Abbots collected tribute. Monks memorized sutras for rank, not understanding. Most reformers would have written treatises. Ikkyu did something far more dangerous. He walked out. Picture this. New Year's Day, Kyoto, 1440. The most important day in the Japanese calendar. Families celebrating, monks blessing homes for good fortune. Tradition says Ikkyu walked through the city streets carrying a human skull on a stick, singing at the top of his lungs, "Attention, attention, every day is a good day to die." People scattered, parents covered children's eyes. The Buddhist establishment was apoplectic. What made him truly dangerous wasn't the theatrics, it was this. Ikkyu didn't criticize corruption from within monastery walls. He drank sake in public, wrote poetry, fell in love with a blind singer named Mori, utterly scandalous for a monk, and still claimed to transmit the purest dharma. The wildest part? Some accounts claim Ikkyu was the illegitimate son of Emperor Gokomatsu, royal blood. He could have lived in a palace, commanded armies, shaped Japanese history. Instead, he chose to call himself Blind Donkey and live in poverty. Why? Ikkyu understood that comfort is more dangerous than poverty. Comfort lets you forget you're dying. Poverty keeps death close, honest, present. Want to know what really terrified the authorities? Ikkyu didn't just fall in love. He wrote poems about it. Listen to this. "At this moment, I'd happily trade all the sutras for one night with you." A monk writing that publicly. The establishment wanted him expelled. Ikkyu's response, "You're scandalized by honest desire, never by your own hypocrisy." He wrote, "Who among Rinzai's descendants really transmits his Zen? It is concealed in this blind donkey." By embracing the role of fool, of someone spiritually worthless, Ikkyu achieved perfect vision. The blind donkey could see what the enlightened masters couldn't. In the Mumonkan, The Gateless Gate, a classic Zen text, Ikkyu studied. Case 1 asks, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" The master answers, "Mu." Not yes, not no. Mu. The refusal to give the mind something to hold. That's what Ikkyu embodied, not through analysis, through direct seeing. When Ikkyu finally died at 87, surrounded by disciples, they begged for a death poem, final words of wisdom. His response? "I've been writing death poems my whole life. You weren't paying attention." The dissolution of the separate self isn't something that happens once at death. It's happening constantly. We call it letting go. Zen calls birth and death the great matter, not a topic, the whole problem of being human. Zen isn't fascinated by death. Zen is fascinated by what's real. You're going to die. You know this intellectually, but have you ever really sat with it? Not as a concept, as a certainty. Try something with me. 5 seconds. This body will stop. If your chest tightened, good. That's honesty. What happened in those 5 seconds? Did you imagine your body stopping? Did fear arise? Did you wonder what's left? That wondering, that's already closer to truth than all the death denial most people live with. Ikkyu's approach was radical, confrontational. Could there be a gentler path to the same truth? Meet Ryokan, a Zen monk who spent his days playing with children and bouncing silk balls. While other masters accumulated disciples, Ryokan lived alone in a hut, barely 8 feet square, smaller than most bathrooms. 1 straw mat, 1 robe, 1 bowl. His name literally means generous fool, and he wore it like a badge of honor. Stories tell of Ryokan discovering lice in his robe one winter. Instead of killing them, he carefully picked them out one by one and placed them in a warm corner of his hut. "Little brothers," he said, "you must be cold." The next day they were back in his robe. He moved them again. This continued for weeks. When a visiting monk asked why he didn't kill them, Ryokan smiled. "They're dying anyway. Why rush them?" That's Ryokan, gentle, absurd, awake. One evening in autumn, Ryokan came home to find his hut completely robbed, everything gone, even the straw mat he slept on. He stood in the doorway of an empty room, and there, through the space where his possessions had been, moonlight flooded in, clear, pure, unobstructed, more beautiful than anything he'd ever owned. His response became one of the most beloved poems in Japanese literature. "The thief left it behind, the moon at my window." Look around. What are you holding on to? Your career, your reputation, your collection of things, accomplishments, identities? Imagine it all disappearing tonight. What's left? Ryokan discovered that loss reveals what cannot be taken. The things we can lose were never truly ours. What we actually are can never be stolen. At age 69, Ryokan met Taishin, a 29-year-old nun. They exchanged poems for 2 years, love letters disguised as Buddhist teaching. When Taishin wrote, "Gloomy clouds shroud the mountain peak in darkness," Ryokan replied, "You must rise above the clouds. Otherwise, how will you ever see the brightness?" He was dying. They both knew it. Ryokan didn't love despite impermanence. He loved because of it. On January 6, 1831, Ryokan died in her arms. His final poem reveals everything. Showing front, showing back, thus falls the autumn leaf. The autumn leaf doesn't choose which side to show as it falls. It doesn't agonize over dignity or appearance. It simply reveals all aspects naturally. Beautiful, decayed, perfect, imperfect. Ryokan realized he wasn't the one choosing how to die. He was the dying itself. In a moment, we'll look at something Hakuin said that startled students for centuries, and why it needs to be understood carefully. There's an even more direct teaching, one that will challenge everything you believe about survival itself. Master Hakuin wrote the most provocative death poem in Buddhist history. Over a large character meaning death, he wrote, "O young folk, if you fear death, die now. Having died once, you won't die again." Stop. Before we go further, I need to be completely clear. Hakuin was talking about letting the false sense of self collapse, never about harming the body. This is contemplative practice, never physical action. Now, what could die now possibly mean? When my own father was dying 2 years ago, I sat in that antiseptic hospital room, fluorescent lights humming, machines beeping their steady rhythm, watching fear move through him in waves, fear of becoming nothing. I wanted to comfort him, to say something wise about Buddhist teachings on death. My mouth was dry. I was terrified too. Of losing him, yes, but also of that same annihilation waiting for me. Then I remembered Hakuin's teaching. The death I was fearing, the annihilation of everything I think I am, was already happening. Every night in sleep, every moment I lost myself in deep concentration, every time I forgot myself completely in laughter or love. The ego dies constantly. I hadn't been paying attention. Do this with me now. Notice you're aware of these words. What is aware of being aware? Notice thoughts arising. What knows you're thinking? That which observes thought without being thought itself. That which knows fear without being afraid. Buddhist psychology calls this Buddha nature. Dogen, founder of Soto Zen, called this Shinjin Datsuraku, dropping body and mind. The same intimacy Ikkyu and Ryokan lived. One translation of the Platform Sutra puts it like this: from the beginning, not a single thing is. If nothing exists as a separate entity to begin with, what is there to lose in death? Are you someone who has awareness, or are you awareness itself, temporarily imagining you're someone who might die? Death isn't something that happens to you. Death is the final dissolving of the story that there was ever a separate you. Accounts of Hakuin's death paint a remarkable scene. That morning, December 11, 1768, Hakuin's attendant found him sitting in meditation posture, eyes closed. Concerned, the attendant approached quietly. Hakuin opened one eye. "Still here, old man?" Then laughed, that deep belly laugh he was known for. 3 hours later, still in that same posture, he was dead. No struggle, no last words, no grasping for more time. He'd already said everything worth saying. Tradition holds that his body was discovered in perfect zazen position, as if the boundary finally dissolved. The masters wouldn't dismiss your fear. They'd ask, what exactly is afraid? Is it actually you, or a story about you? This raises a crucial question. How does this compare to the way most of us in the West have been taught to think about death? Three Japanese monks, 3 ways of laughing at death. But if you're watching this video, you probably weren't raised in a Zen monastery. You were raised in a culture that treats death as the ultimate tragedy. Let's talk about that. In 1969, psychiatrist Elizabeth Kübler-Ross published On Death and Dying, mapping the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It revolutionized Western medicine. Finally, dying patients weren't bodies to manage. They were people with psychological needs. Kübler-Ross helps you accept loss. Zen asks a stranger question. Who is it that lost something? Western psychology treats death as trauma to process. Zen treats it as truth to embody. The existentialists got closer. Heidegger said we live in denial of death, hiding from what he called being toward death. Sartre said death makes life absurd. We create meaning in a universe that will erase us. The Zen masters would say, you're both right about the problem, wrong about who's having it. Because the you that will die, the you that's creating meaning against inevitable erasure, that you is already a fiction, a stream of thoughts convinced it's someone, a temporary process mistaking itself for permanence. Buddhist schools themselves have different approaches to death. Early Buddhism teaches analysis of the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. Study each one. See intellectually that none is permanent, none is self. Zen said, skip the intellectual step, drop directly into experience. We've explored other Buddhist approaches to death: the 49-day Bardo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the cycles of rebirth. Those are maps. Zen asks you to step into the weather. Same destination, different vehicle. Ikkyu carrying a skull through Kyoto. That's Zen, direct confrontation instead of scholarship. The paradox: you can't accept death while believing in the self doing the accepting. That's why Kübler-Ross's acceptance stage is brilliant psychology, yet incomplete liberation. The fear remains until you see through who this you actually is. The Zen approach isn't better or worse. It's asking a completely different question. Western psychology asks, how do we help people cope with death? Zen asks, could the one who needs to cope be the actual problem? This isn't about rejecting Western medicine or psychology. My father died in a hospital, surrounded by compassionate doctors using every tool modern medicine offers. I'm grateful for that. When the medical tools were exhausted, when psychology had done its work, what remained was the question Hakuin asked 250 years ago. If you fear death, die now. Which brings us to the crucial question: how do we actually practice this? The Masters discovered 3 gentle invitations to cultivate this fearlessness. I'm sharing them in order of accessibility. Start with what feels possible, never with what sounds most profound. First, dying to small things. When someone cuts you off in traffic, can you die to the story of being disrespected? When plans change, can you die to the need for control? When you're wrong about something, can you die to being the person who knows? This isn't suppression, it's inquiry. What exactly feels threatened? Practice this 10 times today. Notice the moment of contraction, the tightness in your chest, the defensive thought, and ask, what in me is threatened in this moment? Usually it's a story about who you're supposed to be. Die to that story. See what remains. Second, sleep as practice. Tonight, as you're falling asleep, do this specifically. Lie down. Notice the ceiling. Now say internally, I am, and then your name. Feel that sense of being someone. Now let your eyes close. Keep noticing that sense of being someone until it dissolves. That's death. You do it every night. The Zen masters noticed something we usually miss. We die every night. We surrender everything. Every morning, we wake up and rebuild the same fiction. Could you stay conscious through that dissolution? Never fighting sleep, dissolving with it. Third, the ultimate question. Several times a day, stop and ask yourself, what am I? Never who. What? What is it that's aware in this moment? What's observing your thoughts, your emotions, your fears? Don't answer intellectually. Feel into it. The awareness that knows you're thinking. Has that ever been born? Can it die? The masters discovered that what you truly are can't be threatened because it was never born. If inquiry ever increases anxiety rather than clarity, return to the body or pause completely. This should feel like gentle investigation, never forced introspection. If this feels overwhelming, that's completely natural. We're touching something our conditioning says is dangerous. Notice, are you actually in danger in this moment? Start gently. The master spent decades developing this understanding. What you'll discover, the more you practice this dying, the more alive you become. Before we close, I want to share something that ties all of this together. The actual words Zen masters spoke in their final moments. For 1,000 years, Zen masters have composed death poems, brief verses written or spoken in their final hours. These aren't goodbyes, they're final teachings. Before we hear the actual death poems, you need to understand something. Zen masters weren't always solemn about death. They were often hilarious. There's a famous Zen exchange that captures this humor. A monk asked, "Where do we go when we die?" The master replied, "I don't know." The monk, shocked, "But you're a Zen master." The master smiled, "Yes, never a dead one." Or consider Master Ikkyu's attendant asking, "Master, where will you go when you die?" Ikkyu replied, "To hell probably. I'll go first and warm it up for you." These aren't nihilistic jokes. They're pointing to something. The thing that panics about death can't actually be found. Now listen to these final poems. Master Jisei wrote on his deathbed, "Holding forth this sword, I cut the void in two. Where the void does not exist, I cleave asunder the wind." You can't cut emptiness. Even the sword that cuts through illusion is itself an illusion. Master Shunzan. In the midst of the world's turmoil, I have created my own quiet world. And now I close the gate. The monk Hakuin, dying at unknown age. Empty-handed I entered the world, barefoot I leave it, my coming, my going, two simple happenings that got entangled. Two simple happenings. Birth, death. We tangled them into a story called Me. And my personal favorite, Master Sengai's death poem. I hate to die. I really hate to die. That's it. That's the whole poem. Brutally honest. No pretense of transcendence. No spiritual bypassing. Even that honesty, I hate to die, is another thought arising in awareness that was never born. Finally, Dogen, founder of Soto Zen. 54 years lighting up the sky. A quivering leap smashes a billion worlds. Ha! Notice what's missing from these poems. No begging, no rage, no "I mattered." Observation, like describing weather. Because from the Zen perspective, death isn't an ending. It's the final letting go of the illusion that there was ever someone separate enough to end. These weren't people suppressing fear, they were people who had discovered that the someone who should be afraid was never there to begin with. If you had to write one honest line for your own death poem, what would it be? Share in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what arises for you. Death isn't the opposite of life. Death is life's most honest teacher. Every moment offers the choice. Will you cling to the story of being someone separate, or die into the truth of what you actually are? Sitting with my father as he died, I finally understood. He wasn't going somewhere. He was coming home. The awareness that had been looking through his eyes for 78 years wasn't disappearing. It was simply no longer pretending to be contained in one particular form. And if you're sitting with this teaching while grieving someone you've lost, you don't need to be strong. You need to be present. Grief is love with nowhere to go. Let it move through you. Why do we incarnate in these temporary forms if consciousness is truly deathless? Why does the infinite play at being finite? I don't know. And there's something liberating about not knowing. What I do know, Ikkyu carried a skull through the streets to show us that death is always present. Ryokan lost everything and found the moon. Hakuin told us to die now so we could finally live. They were ordinary people who looked directly at what most of us spend our lives avoiding, and found freedom on the other side. Shunryu Suzuki, who brought Zen to America in the 1960s, said, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." That paradox, you're already complete, death can't touch you, and you still need to practice, that's the Zen approach in one sentence. Before you move to the next video, sit quietly for 2 minutes and ask, how would I live today if I truly accepted that death is as natural as breathing? The paradox these masters discovered: when you stop fearing death, you start truly living. When you practice dying consciously, you discover what was never born. If this exploration opened something profound in your understanding, subscribe and join our community, exploring these life-changing teachings. Share in the comments. What came up for you during today's practice? What would your death poem be? And soon we'll go further into the question that waits behind all of this. What becomes of consciousness when the body falls away? Remember, you're already practicing dying every night. You might as well learn to do it consciously.